Dr. Hoge, last week, Moderna announced it had developed a vaccine that was 94.5% effective. What went through your head when you heard the news?
The second they started calling out the case numbers, and they said that of the 95 cases, 90 cases were on placebo. And I'll have to admit, I went ear to ear with a grin and almost didn't hear anything else for the next 2 minutes. It was this feeling of incredible relief. We've been working really hard for a year, but for many years on this technology. And it's just this feeling of, oh my goodness, it hasn't all been for nothing. There is going to be a vaccine that's available.
Can you just boil down the news you heard and so somebody at home without any kind of medical background might understand?
So the clinical trial involved 30,000 participants. And the value of these clinical trials is that they're placebo controlled. And so you randomize people 1-to-1 to either receive a placebo or the vaccine. And so there's 15,000 people that receive placebo and 15,000 people that receive vaccine. And for the last 2 to 3 months, those people have been going about their daily lives, hopefully practicing social distance and other things, but ultimately going to work and doing things that might give them a risk of infection. And what we've been doing is an independent data and safety monitoring board has been counting up every time somebody becomes infected with COVID. And those cases are counted up until there's overwhelming statistical evidence that there were more cases on the placebo arm than the vaccine arm. What we learned about last Sunday was that they had reached 90 cases. 90 out of the 15,000 people on placebo had developed COVID. And that contrasted with, in the 15,000 that received vaccine, only 5 cases. Only 5 people had received COVID or had contracted COVID, which meant that the relative protection was about 94.5%. The difference between the 90 out of 15,000 and the 5 out of 15,000.
And in fact, Pfizer and now AstraZeneca are coming up with vaccines. How do you feel about these other companies that are coming forward with their own vaccines? Is that good news?
I think it's great news. I think everybody sort of accepts that the only way we're really going to stop this pandemic is a vaccine. We have to beat the virus everywhere. And since there's billions of us on the planet, 7 billion of us, we need many billions of doses. And so from the beginning, even from earliest part of this year, we said the most vaccine we'd probably be able to make in 2021 is about 1 billion doses. And we're still on track for that. But 1 billion doses will only cover 500 million people, 500 million people. And so since our vaccine requires 2 doses per person, it would only cover 500 million. So there are literally billions of doses more that need to be created by others. So as a group of companies, we've actually been rooting for each other, because if we only end up with 500 million people covered, the pandemic doesn't end. We don't get our lives back. And so what's really been happening between the companies, coordinated by Operation Warp Speed, but frankly, I think between the companies organically, is an unprecedented level of coordination, because everybody recognizes that we all have to deliver. When any one of us achieves a result like we did last week, we often email each other, and I emailed congratulations to AstraZeneca just this week, because we're counting on each other. We're counting on them to come through just like they were counting on us to come through to beat back the virus.
Why is it so difficult to produce huge amounts of these vaccines?
It's the complexity of making a medicine, making sure it's done to the highest quality standards and the highest degree of control that adds the additional challenge. It's not just like trying to create something else that we might create billions of every year as a society. And so you have to invest in manufacturing. You have to invest in purpose-built manufacturing lines. You have to train people. They have to get extremely good. You can't get it right 95% of the time. I mean, 99.999% right. And you have to establish quality systems around that allow you to measure it and control it and make sure that when somebody takes your vaccine, whether it's Moderna's or AstraZeneca's or Pfizer's, they can be sure it's a high-quality vaccine. And even with the incredible financial resources that the US government has brought to bear, and many of the companies have brought to bear, it's still a huge lift. And there's still lots of potholes along the way that you have to plan for and get around.
Let's talk about the technique that you and Pfizer use, something called messenger RNA. Can you explain for 8th graders watching this, or people who have an 8th grade understanding of science, how this actually works?
Sure. This is one, Katie, I might have to take a couple stabs at, because I'm still working on explaining this to some of my family. After 10 years in the field, there's something a little bit counterintuitive about it, but let me try. So messenger RNA is a molecule that exists in all of our cells that is the instructions for making every protein in your body, every protein in life. And so it's just a set of instructions. It literally tells the cell what protein to make and how much of it to make. It's a very natural molecule. In fact, it's one of the oldest molecules in life. And what we do as a messenger RNA company is, rather than giving you the protein, which is what most vaccines do. If you think about a flu vaccine, you'll grow up the protein in eggs or something like that. You'll purify it. You'll then administer it, and the body will have an immune response to that protein. It sort of works with your body, not on your body. It provides the instructions to your immune system.
So it triggers the immune response in both cases, but in this case, you're not injecting the body with a version of the virus. You're simply instructing the cells how to deal with the virus.
That's exactly right. And the big difference is, do you inject a virus or a broken piece of the virus, or do you just inject the instructions for what the virus looks like, if you will, a wanted poster that then the immune system gets to learn on and train on. And when it encounters the virus, it's not naive. Your immune system knows what it's looking for, says, oh, I've seen this wanted poster before, and I'm now going to be able to protect against it. And we do think ultimately this technology will change the way people make medicine in the future. If you think about it, we move away from creating drugs that work on your body. They kind of come from the outside and do something to it, and actually try and move to a world where we're just providing information to your cells, to your body, in the way that's used to processing it.
How involved are you in distribution, and how concerned are you about rapid distribution to the populations who need it the most?
So we've worked with the US government, and particularly the folks at the Department of Defense under Operation Warp Speed, so General Perna's team, pretty intensely over the summer and fall in anticipation of an approval or an emergency use authorization. Such that, we now know down to the hour what's happening post-approval and post-authorization to try and get the trucks rolling, if you will, to the states so they have access to the vaccine. We've been working to make sure they understand all of the characteristics of the vaccine, how it has to be stored and distributed. We've been working with companies that they brought in, like McKesson, to start depoting and stockpiling some of the vaccine. And we're going to continue to work around the clock, it seems. We're literally 24/7 as an operation right now, to make sure that we're manufacturing on a regular schedule, delivering, those are getting filled, and then ultimately move into the distribution supply chain. It's important to note, though, that as a company, our limits, we're only about 1,300 people, mostly in Massachusetts. And so where we will hand off to the government and rely on the government for distribution is after filling at the factory and ultimately from a depot. Distributing to the states is something that really only the United States government and the states can manage effectively. So that will be the primary mechanism by which people will get their vaccines, through their state departments of health.
How worried are you about this delayed transition? I know President-elect Biden has expressed real concern that if this isn't taken care of and there isn't a really appropriate handoff and an understanding of logistics, that this could cost lives.
Yeah, it's obviously a concern. It's not one that really exists at our level per se, and the reason I say that is we're interacting with career folks in the civil service, in the Department of Health and Human Services, obviously the Department of Defense, the uniformed service officers that we're interacting with, and they are 1,000% committed. They're not going anywhere, and I think folks can take some comfort in that. I think it is at a level above us. There's obviously always concerns that if those plans are laid out and operationalizing, and there's new executive authority, new administration that has to make decisions, it's obviously not helpful for them to not have time to get up to speed on why decisions were made. There's a lot of choices that have been made over the last 6 months by those career folks. And so that obviously would be a concern. It doesn't exactly exist at our level, though. I can say that I've just been inspired by the career members of our civil service and the military, and the way they show up every day, just as vested as we are, even sometimes more so, in doing the right thing. So I think there's reason for optimism there.
But have you guys applied for emergency authorization already?
We've not. What we've said is sometime in the next week or so, we expect we will, but we've got work to do. We just got access to the data last week. And as you can imagine, there's a tremendous amount to pour over and to prepare an appropriate and high quality filing for the FDA. So we're working on that now. Expect that to happen in the next week or so. And then we're hoping for an emergency use authorization sometime the second half of December.
When do you think your vaccine can get out there? Do you have any timetable yet?
So the FDA are the only people that can decide when this happens. But on the assumption that they decide within the next 2 to 3 weeks, let's say, is in the middle of December, which is where we're aiming ourselves. We want to make sure that we have as much vaccine available as possible for the second half of December to start that distribution process. And what we've been working towards is about 20 million doses by the end of December that we'd be able to hand off to the folks at Operation Warp Speed so that they can actually literally get it into vaccination centers as fast as possible.
Who will get the vaccine first? Do you know, Dr. Hoge?
I don't. It really is up to the CDC and their advisory committee on immunization practices. At the end of the day, the federal government has delegated to them the responsibility of figuring out who gets it first. It's fair to say, though, that the CDC will just issue guidelines. What will really happen is Operation Warp Speed will distribute our 20 million doses in December to the states in proportion to their jurisdictions. And then the individual states will look at the CDC guidelines, look at what's happening in their communities, and decide the best place to deploy. I think if everything goes to the CDC guidelines, it's pretty clear that the healthcare providers, those frontline healthcare workers that we need to keep safe during the pandemic so that we can keep caring for people when they become ill, they're going to be the first folks vaccinated. And there may be up to 20 million of them across the country. Then I think you move to critical infrastructure. So frontline workers, people who work in food security, people who work in government, firefighters, police, first responders. And then ultimately to those that are at the highest risk of severe COVID-19. So those over the age of 65 or those who have comorbid conditions. And I think that's where the CDC's recommendations will come out. Certainly based on the conversations, that's what it seems like will be the guidance.
Will school-age children be vaccinated?
I hope so. I got to tell you, as a parent who's been doing virtual school for most of the fall and expect to do it for a good part of the next year, I feel deeply the need to get our kids back in school, make sure that teachers are safe and get our kids back in school. And so as a company, Moderna, just like some of the other companies, have begun the work of showing the vaccine is safe and effective in children. That starts with adolescents, so those 12 and up, and then you move into the 5 to 12-year-old school-age kids. And those studies are actually starting in the coming weeks with us and others. The goal of those will be that by, let's say, the end of this school year, there'd be data to show the vaccine is safe and effective, the right dose to give to children. And ultimately, we all want to make sure that everybody who's a school-age child could receive a vaccine before next school year so that we could start in September of 2021 with a normal school year, soccer games on Saturdays and everything that we've come to miss.
I know diversity in clinical trials is critically important, and there hasn't been nearly enough in the past. How were you able to ensure that you did have a diverse population?
Well, the first thing is we had to recognize that initially it wasn't very diverse. And so we started our clinical trial at the very end of July. And by the end of August, about 1 month in, we'd recruited about half the trial, about 15,000 of the 30,000 people. But the population was unfortunately not very diverse. There was only 4 or 5% African American. There was around 10% those of Hispanic or Latinx descent. And it was clear that we were not going to have, while that might be okay by historical standards, it was not going to be enough to generate real confidence in the vaccine in those communities. And so we took a very difficult choice. The first week of September, we came out publicly and said, we're failing to meet our expectations. We need to look more like the country in terms of the ethnic makeup of our trial. And therefore, we're going to slow down our clinical trial. In the middle of a pandemic, in a bit of a race against the virus and maybe a friendly race against other companies, that was a pretty tough choice to make. But it was one that we felt was the right thing to do. The reason we slowed down is that we thought we need to go work with the 100 investigator sites across the country that we were working with. These are doctors' offices in local communities, and help them figure out how to reach out to those communities that are underrepresented, particularly the Black and Hispanic communities that were massively underrepresented in our study, and do everything we can to help work with them, build trust with those communities. You have to leave the door open. You have to work 3 times as hard in places where there is not trust. And there's a huge trust deficit in those communities. We're really pleased to say that 6 or 8 weeks later, when we completed enrollment, we'd actually increased the ethnic and racial makeup of the study to be almost bang on to the United States. We know that the data, therefore, will be sufficiently representative that people from those communities can have confidence the vaccine was evaluated, and if it's effective in them. And in fact, we announced that it looks terrific. The results look equally good in those populations. But that still requires us to work the next step to build trust with those communities to receive the vaccine. And there's a lot of vaccine hesitancy across the country, including in those communities, and we've got work to do there.
And as you say, you still have a lot of work to do to convince the population writ large that they can trust, people of color can trust the medical establishment, given the very checkered history with Tuskegee and operating on enslaved people. I mean, it's going to be a bit of a hill to climb, isn't it?
The thing that we discovered was most important is that you have to work with those voices that are already trusted in the community, whether those are faith-based leaders or people that are just present in the community offering healthcare advice. There are voices there who can actually carry that message. And you have to make sure they understand and they have access to information. They make their own judgments about whether to recommend this or not. And those that do can then become quite powerful advocates to their communities.
Moderna and Pfizer's vaccines, Dr. Hoge, require special treatment, if you will. Cold temperatures for Moderna, subarctic temperatures for Pfizer, and outside those conditions, they have a limited shelf life. Does this give AstraZeneca's vaccine an edge because it doesn't have those requirements? It can be produced in mass quantities and can be shipped, and it's quite inexpensive. Are all those things pointing to a better situation for AstraZeneca?
So I think the reality of the AstraZeneca vaccine, the reason why I was so excited about the announcement this week, is that although the efficacy wasn't as strong, the average efficacy was 70% versus 95%, the potential for many more doses and for being the ability to distribute them into areas that maybe don't have freezers but do have refrigerators provides a real opportunity here. The cost of the vaccines, I think in general, cost does matter for sure. And the AstraZeneca vaccine can be made more cheaply, which is good. But it's important to note that the cost of these vaccines, whether you're talking about $5 or $20 is per dose, is a fraction of the costs that are being incurred just with things like testing, which we all seem to do on a regular basis, or any of the other interventions. And so they're quite reasonably inexpensive.
So how much will the Moderna vaccine cost?
So we sold it to the United States government at $20 a dose, and the U.S. government has agreed that they will not charge anybody for those doses, regardless of your ability to pay. And so essentially the vaccine is going to be free to Americans.
Every vaccine that's being created.
Every vaccine purchased by Operation Warp Speed, including the Moderna vaccine and the AstraZeneca vaccine and the Pfizer vaccine, all of that will be free to Americans through the Warp Speed initiative. So,
will I get to pick which vaccine I want?
You will receive a vaccine that's approved from the FDA, that's safe, and that's going to provide a benefit. The Department of Health in your state might make a determination to say that certain high-risk populations, we want to get a vaccine that's got a higher efficacy, like the Moderna vaccine with 95%. And if you're healthier, maybe we're going to give you one that has a lower efficacy because you don't need it as much. And some of those choices may happen in terms of how they allocate, but it'll really fall to the departments of health in the states to determine how to distribute it. I don't think it'll be a situation where consumers will get to decide until everybody's had a chance to get a vaccine from the federal government, and that may be next summer, at which point maybe people will have the ability to go to CVS and make their own buy.
Let me go through quickly some questions from social media. How long will the immunity provided by the vaccines last?
I think a year seems pretty safe at this point. We don't have a year's worth of follow-up, but we've got 6 months in some of our studies. And it looks like the early data shows that we're achieving levels of immunity in the blood that we think will be protective for at least a year. In the worst case scenario, you'd need a booster once a year, like a flu shot. I think it's unlikely that that's going to be necessary. And the reason I say that is when you see vaccines that are this effective, 95% in our case, and it's really the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines that I'm talking about that are this effective. I think 70% for AstraZeneca is a little bit lower, but 95%, when you see vaccines that are 95% effective, that's kind of like your measles vaccine or some of the other tetanus vaccines that we're used to. You don't need to get those every year. You can go every 5 years, every 10 years, maybe even once in your life. And so when you see this kind of efficacy, protection, I think it augurs well, it bodes well for the fact that maybe you won't need one every year, maybe every 5 years, or maybe only when you end up, with waning immunity. You get a test to show that you have lower immunity in your blood, and you just get a booster maybe once every 5 or 10 years.
Will the vaccine prevent spreading of the virus?
So we don't know for sure yet, but there are hints that it will. And so we're optimistic that the vaccine will prevent infections. We know from the studies we've run that it prevents disease. And so that's probably the most important thing. If you never get sick, you never have symptoms, you never get hospitalized, it kind of moved through you and you never knew it was there, then maybe it doesn't matter as much. But the reason is that the studies that we're running, the endpoints that we were counting were when people got sick, because people could tell you they got sick. They could call you up and say, I'm not feeling well, and you could test them. And that's how we knew that those cases had happened. In order to figure out when somebody got sick but didn't have an infection, what's called asymptomatic infection, you actually have to test them at regular intervals over time. And so we're going to bring everybody back in on the study at 3 months and 6 months and 12 months and figure out if they became infected asymptomatically. But that takes time. And so we won't really get that data until the early part of next year.
What are possible side effects from the vaccine?
Well, fortunately, there haven't been any safety issues in our vaccine, and I haven't seen any reported for the others as well. So that's good news. The kinds of side effects, therefore, that people are seeing are not really safety, but they're more tolerability. Think of them as the aches and pains that you get when you get a vaccine. When you go get a flu vaccine, people will say you may have some muscle aches and pains, joint aches and pains, a headache. You may occasionally, rarely have a fever. Those are the sorts of things that have been seen.
That brings me to my next question. Are mRNA vaccines problematic for people who have autoimmune disease?
There's no evidence that mRNA medicines are problematic for autoimmune disease. If anything, I think they might be safer, although we have to see that over time. The reason I'd say that is that there's no viral vector. There's no virus that's infecting you here. So there's a lot of other proteins in a viral vector vaccine, like the AstraZeneca or Johnson & Johnson ones, that could do other things to your immune system. And similarly, in the recombinant protein vaccines, you usually give an adjuvant, which can kick off your immune system in a non-specific way. In the case of the mRNA vaccines, there's neither of those things. It's really purely the information. And so there's reason for optimism there, but there's really no data yet. Certainly, there's no evidence that it's less safe.
Can mRNA put your immune system in overdrive for certain patients?
So it really depends on what you're making with the mRNA. And the short answer for the vaccines is no, because the mRNA is just making the spike protein in the coronavirus. And so your immune system is in overdrive against the coronavirus, and only will get turned on if it sees the coronavirus in the future. We do, in the case of cancer vaccines, or in the case of some of our cancer therapies, try and induce an immune response and ramp it up. And so there are definitely cases where we'll express things that will try and kick off your immune system. But we do those very different types of things in cancer, where we're trying to, as you just said, turn on the immune system so it starts attacking things, in that case, the cancer.
What about pregnant women, Dr. Hoge?
We do need to make sure the vaccine is safe in pregnant women. We're in discussions with the FDA right now, as are the other vaccine developers, to figure out the best way to do that. There's a couple of ways to do it. One is you run a small study. The other is that you just follow people over time who incidentally get pregnant and make sure through like a registry that there's no safety issues there. We have completed all of the necessary preclinical work to show that there's no reproductive toxicity issues. So we believe it's going to be safe. But what remains to be done is just follow that more carefully and make sure that there are no showstoppers or concerns.
Do you feel that safety has been compromised because of the speed in which these vaccines have been developed?
I do not. I think actually this has got to be the gold standard for how you respond to pandemics in the future. If you think about the size of the trials that have been run and the deliberate nature in which they've run through it. We've run through a phase 1 study, a phase 2 study of 600 people, and now a phase 3 study of 30,000 people. That's not commonly done for any drug that's approved. In fact, it's a huge number. And if you add to that we did that and Pfizer did that with 30,000 and AstraZeneca's got 25,000, there's going to be hundreds of thousands of people that have been tested across these vaccine platforms. That's just not precedented. There's not that kind of confidence that we've ever really been able to have around new drugs, new medicines, new vaccines in this case. And so I think people should take a huge degree of confidence from that. Now, we don't have long-term follow-up. To be fair, we do not have 2 years of history post that vaccine. And so we're going to need to follow that very closely. But the overwhelming majority, like 99+% events that have been seen historically with drugs and vaccines happen in the first 2 months after your vaccine, not 2 years later. And when you say you've got that kind of confidence that you've looked really intensely for the first 2 months and you've got hundreds of thousands of people you've looked in, I think you can take a lot of confidence. I certainly do. And I don't think there's been any sacrifices on safety. We have moved quickly. I think the biggest risk taken were financial. So in that sense, I think the American people and the federal government deserve a lot of credit. Congress, through the CARES Act and the administration on Warp Speed, I think the American people underwrote the development of vaccines for the entire world. If you look at the vaccines that are now getting bought by everybody else, whether it's Japan or Europe or the rest of the world, including in low and middle income countries, it's really these six. Although we didn't participate in the WHO activities and many of the things that were multilateral, we did as a country underwrite the creation of the solution, of the six solutions that we think are going to get deployed most broadly across the world. And did it in record time and relied a lot on American ingenuity and the high quality of American civil service and workers to make this happen. And I think it's something we will look back on and be proud of.
Someone asked, if I get the vaccine, am I protected against COVID, even if 50% of other people are vaccinated?
The studies that we're running are happening in the middle of the pandemic. And so nobody else is vaccinated. And so if we're offering 95% protection against COVID in the middle of the pandemic in very hot areas, you can have confidence that even if the people around you aren't vaccinated, that you will not be getting COVID. What we don't know, and I think what's underlying that question is, will the virus still be passing between us? And if you've got vaccinated, maybe you don't get sick, but what about the other 50% of people who didn't get vaccinated? And in that case, I think the answer is yes, they will probably still be at risk until we cross a threshold of 60 to 70% of people that have been vaccinated or have immunity because they were sick.
Can this virus mutate, Dr. Hoge, and create a new strain of COVID 21, for example, where you're going to have to go back to square one and start all over again? How possible is that, not meaning to rain on your well-deserved parade?
I think it's the thing that should always concern us. Pandemics do happen, and they happen at a regular interval. So this virus has evolved. It has mutated a little bit during the year of 2020. Fortunately, the mutations have not been enough to move away from protection from our vaccines, and I think they won't be. If I were to sort of conjecture, I'd say this virus would have to make a lot of changes to avoid the vaccines that are currently in development, not just the Moderna one. That's because we're making the whole spike protein. There are 1,700 amino acids, little pieces of protein on it. And evolution or mutation works one amino acid at a time. So if our immune system can recognize all 1,700, you can change a few of those amino acids, but you're really going to have to make whole scale changes, hundreds of them, before it's unrecognizable to your immune system. So I think SARS-CoV-2, I'm very optimistic that it's not going to mutate around our vaccines, and we're going to get through this. Your question, though, is about COVID-21. Will there be another coronavirus pandemic? And the answer there is almost certainly yes. Probably not this virus, but at some point in the decade or 100 years ahead of us, a different coronavirus will move out of animals, find its way into humans, and we will have no immunity to it. And then we'll be racing again to beat it again. That is almost inevitable as well.
But do you think the technology that you all have established will help create new vaccines in the future in a much more expedited way?
I hope so. I really hope that becomes a long-lasting benefit of what we've been through in 2020, is that governments around the world, including the US, look at the technologies that were most useful and say, well, we did something epic, heroic. We did in 1 year the thing that nobody thought was possible. Now let's figure out how to do it in 6 months. Now let's figure out how we can respond more quickly in the next pandemic. But I think it will be technologies like messenger RNA that are going to be at the center of that, because at the end of the day, they're so flexible. And so I'm very optimistic that we will get better and better at being able to beat back pandemics with technology like messenger RNA and others, perhaps even therapeutics.